Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. I am MagMongoSlade. This is episode 2 of our continued review of the Vince McMahon, Mr. McMahon documentary on Netflix, which was released September 25th, 2024. Episode 2 is going to feature talent. So, throughout these 6 episodes, there's a lot of talk about steroids, wrestler deaths, unions, and Vince's relationship to the boys. So, in Vince's relationship to the boys, you see that he starts the business. Once he takes over from his dad, he inherits all of these contracts or whatever. He starts making his own moves. He starts trying to compete with the various territories. He's going in, bringing in guys like Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts, Randy Savage, etc. So once he builds his empire, the opportunities start to come in. The money starts to come in, merchandising. The boys are richer than they've ever been. Then Jesse Ventura wants to start a union. Of course, they were going to talk about the union. I was surprised that Jesse Ventura himself was not in the documentary. So Vince talks candidly about the union. And he basically says nobody really had Jesse's back on this thing. Now, the way Teddy Atlas told the story is that once Hogan snitched, and Hogan admitted that he snitched, so it is what it is, that Vince called everybody in one at a time, threatened to fire everybody who wanted to join the union. The way Vince told it, nobody had Jesse's back anyway. Bret Hart, of course, says wrestling needs to have a union. But the union still has not happened yet. This was 40 years ago. This was WrestleMania 2, apparently. But think about that for a second. Jesse Ventura was going to try to ruin WrestleMania 2 by starting up a union in wrestling. A lot of people are pro-union. I'm not going to get into that. It's just not the time or the place for it right now. But once you look at it from the perspective of you got to protect your company, and unions are a threat to the company. They jack up costs. They also often lead to work stoppages. These things can be detrimental to your company. So when you talk about something like this, you see how defensive Vince gets about these things. Is it a surprise that, they would discuss both the Wendy Richter and the Bret Hart screw jobs, as Vince felt like he was protecting the company? So you get a sense that, and it's bipolar in a way, where Vince at one point in time later in the documentary, I think in episode 6, he says he's been like a father figure to pretty much all the talent. Undertaker says it, and John Cena says it, and Bret Hart even says it. But at the same time, he also realizes that sometimes you have to protect the business from the boys, because they want to do things like start unions. Because Undertaker wants to continue hitting people in the head with chairs, which was a surprise to me. That he's like, chairs are a staple. I like hitting people in the head with chairs. I like getting hit in the head with chairs. The boys are doing steroids. And as independent contractors, it is their business if they want to do steroids. But doing steroids is illegal. They want to do lines of cocaine. They want to drink and drive. And you have to protect the image of the company. They had this really fantastic scene where Vince is in front of the WWF logo and he looks and says, and it's overacted, he's a terrible actor, "When you see this logo, you'll know that it's family-friendly entertainment your family can be proud of." I was like, ugh. But it's that kind of shit that he has to do in order to protect the company. Because the boys are out there literally, in some cases, killing themselves, destroying themselves. Not just in the ring working, but in the bars, in the locker room with needles. And he is now being forced to protect the boys from themselves, even though he doesn't feel like he should have to. This leads us to episode 6, where we get the video footage of Vince McMahon being confronted about all of the wrestler deaths. The Eddie Guerreros, the Brian Pillmans, Test, Big Boss Man, all these guys who died in their late 30s, early 40s. And this is where Vince looks the absolute worst, of course, because he is sitting there absorbing this sympathy, and he's being given an opportunity to sympathize and say, you know what, maybe even throw a bone and say, the lifestyle's rough. He doesn't even do that. He just kind of says, no responsibility. And then he starts mocking the guy. He's so defensive and protective. He's just protecting his company. At this point, he's throwing the boys on the barbecue. He's like, look, I can't do anything about these guys, which is technically true. But that's not what people want to hear. People don't want to hear there's nothing you can do. They want you to say you're going to do something, that something is going to change. What people want to hear is that you are going to protect the wrestlers, that the wrestlers matter to you. And Vince can't manage to say that. Then we talk about Owen Hart, a situation where he continued the show, and his reasoning was the people came to see a show. They didn't come to see anyone die. And I was like stunned, because I'm thinking like there had to have been a better answer than that. So Brett says that if it was Shane, because they showed this video that, Brett said if it was Shane that would have fallen, he would have stopped the show. And then Vince says, well, not even if it was Shane. If it was me, just scoop me up and keep the show going. And I was like, wow, the show, the company, the show, the business, that means that much to him. That he doesn't care if he conks out at the show. Don't stop the show. So when you see in the dichotomy that the boys mean little in comparison to the company itself. The protections have to be forcefully pushed into all of these protections for the boys. A wellness policy that they actually stick to, concussion protocols. Christopher Nowitzki was in the documentary, and both Vince and Steve Austin, oddly enough, are kind of like CTE. Steve Austin said he don't believe in it. He don't believe in CTE. It's like the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. It's not a real thing. But Vince, saw that the CTE thing was starting to gain some momentum and wanted to get out in front of it. Babyface himself. Because Nowitzki says in the documentary that he rejected it at first. And he continues to reject that CTE and brain damage is why Chris Benoit did what he did. Vince continues, right, at least as far as this documentary is concerned, to accept that Chris Benoit killed his family due to CTE. And at least to a degree, you can look at his reasoning logically. He's like, well, you see these videos of him doing the flying headbutt, it's a work. Okay, but were the chair shots a work too? Because those things are real. We get it, the flying headbutt is a work. Okay. But he was hitting the head with chairs for decades too. He probably fell awkwardly during pile drivers or brain busters or, whatever. And who knows, maybe he actually did hit his head on somebody's shoulder or their head or the mat or whatever and doing the flying headbutt. I think the science is pretty clear about what happened to Chris Benoit's brain. And Vince is kind of like, you're responsible for your own behavior. Chris Benoit is a monster. Which is, okay, I can accept that. But eventually he warmed up to it and decided CTE was real, and they put in concussion protocols. He had to be pushed into that. He had to be shamed into it. He had to be shamed into the second wellness policy because of Eddie Guerrero. Chris Nowinski is asked by the producers, did Vince start working with you guys on the concussion protocols because it's good business or because it was good for the boys? A dastardly question. Because at this point in the documentary, this is episode 6, of course, you get the idea that Vince is only doing this to protect the business. That he don't really care about the boys. If the boys have 100 concussions, he don't care. But you want to know what was never asked in the concussion section? If Vince himself ever had a concussion. That question never comes up ever. Nobody ever asks, is it possible that Vince McMahon has brain damage? He's been hit in the head with chairs too. He got hit in the face with a shovel by The Undertaker. He's taken as many chair shots to the head as a lot of other guys. And didn't put his hands up. Just took them straight to the head. That would have been an interesting subject to bring up. Hey, Vince, how many concussions have you had? I mean, he admitted to doing steroids, just like the rest of the boys. He did some stunts that, some of the other boys did. They didn't show him ziplining at WrestleMania 12, which is what I would have expected, but they didn't do that. But he did do that, by the way. He did the Shawn Michaels zip at WrestleMania 12 before Shawn did it. So Vince often does the same thing that the boys do. They didn't show the clip of him teaching whatever that football player is how to take a pratfall. He didn't have no problem doing these things. Nobody ever asked if Vince ever had a concussion. Is it possible Vince could have had brain damage? But they wanted to ask Chris Nowinski because they wanted to see where he thinks Vince McMahon's mind is on it. But Nowinski is a little sharp. He's kind of sharp. He was like, it doesn't matter. It was good for the boys and it's good for business. Which is the perfect answer. So you get a sense that Vince McMahon is talking about how he's a father figure to the boys. But he's not really all that down with the protections for the boys. Doesn't want them to have a union. Doesn't really care if they do steroids and recreational drugs. There's nothing he can do about that until he's forced. CTE and concussions, is it real? Maybe. We'll take it seriously because, they're coming after the NFL and they're suing the NFL for millions and millions of dollars. So maybe we ought to take it seriously. If he gets into any kind of contractual issues with the boys, he comes down on them with an absolute hammer, like he did with Wendy, like he did with Brett. They didn't mention China, but that was a situation with her too, where she wanted more money. There was also the whole thing with Stephanie and Triple H that never was mentioned. China was not mentioned at all in that documentary. But then there's also the Ring Boy scandal. Because the Ring Boys are part of the crew. Now, they're not wrestlers, but they're part of the crew. And you see that Vince not really sure what was going on with the Ring Boy scandal. And he's being destroyed by Phil Mushnick and everybody else. Because there's a pedophile ring within the WWF. And the one person that he is kind of protecting is Pat Patterson. You know, you got Tony Atlas in the documentary talk about he didn't like Pat Patterson because he grabbed his pecker. He kept grabbing my pecker. And I'm like, oh God. Oh God. Now we just got 15 more years of Pat Patterson did horrible stuff to us. But this also makes Vince look terrible. Because now he's going on Donahue, and this con artist, Murray Hodgson, is going after him for allowing sexual harassment in the WWF. You're not trying to protect the talent. You're not trying to protect these young men. You're a careless, irresponsible leader, yada, yada, yada. And the crowd is cheering this guy. They don't know he's a con artist. They don't know that in a few years, this guy's name will almost never be mentioned again. And also, they went through all the trouble of showing all the lawsuits that were settled, like Tom Cole. They didn't mention at all that that guy was a con artist. Murray Hodgson was a con artist. They didn't mention that at all. Interesting. In any event. So, you're setting up Vince to be cold. He wants to have this broader WWF family that includes the McMahons, but it also includes Undertaker and Shawn and Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shelton Benjamin and all these guys too. At the same time, though, he's not really all about protecting them. And anything that he does to help the boys, it's really just to help himself. And this is, of course, Jimmy Snuka. Now, Jimmy Snuka comes up in here, but it's not harped on. You know, they kind of breeze right by it, the Jimmy Snuka thing. But for those of you who are too young, Superfly Jimmy Snuka was the top draw of the WWF when Vince took over. 1982, 1983, Superfly Jimmy Snuka was the biggest star in the company. He wasn't the world champion. That was Bob Backlund. But he was the biggest star in the company. And he was a cocaine addict who was abusive to a young lady by the name of Nancy Argentino. Nancy Argentino died in a hotel room in 1983, if I remember correctly. The coroner, who went by the name of Dr. Isidore Mihalakis, all right? Dr. Mihalakis said this: the clear-cut forensics weren't there, but the suspicion was there. I did not have a clear-cut case. It was a very worrisome case. Obviously, there was enough there to arouse my suspicion, but not enough to make it to trial. Just because she was beaten doesn't mean she was beaten to death. And this was years and years and years later. The girl died in 1983. All right. So a lot of people believe that Vince will do anything for the business. The business comes first. Heyman even says later in the documentary that the only monogamous relationship that Vince McMahon has is between him and that company. Him and the WWF. That was it. That's all he cares about. And if you look at his relationship to the boys, you know, the destruction of the unions, him trying to skirt the responsibility for these boys doing steroids and dying young, not really paying attention to the Ring Boy scandal, not being very alert to what was going on there. Some people would even say bringing Pat Patterson back after he was accused. Some people would say that was irresponsible. You know, but then there's also the attitude that he had about talent rating, right? Like his whole thing was he was offering guys better opportunities when they were leaving AWA or Georgia Championship Wrestling or World Class or whatever to come work for him. It was more money, better opportunities, pal. I'm competing with you. And then the reverse happened, and Hall and Nash left, and Sean Waltman left, and Ted DiBiase left, and He went on TV and started talking about how Ted Turner's big money is trying to put him out of business. The WWF is a family business. Ted Turner's a multi-billionaire. He was disappointed in Hulk Hogan, heartbroken that Hulk Hogan would leave and compete against him. Hogan gave me his word. He would never compete against me. Just like you gave Bret your word that you was going to keep him with the WWF for the rest of his life. He let the Clique do the curtain call. He told them they could do it. And then they did it, and he decided, I don't like it. Somebody's got to get punished for this. Heads will roll. Paul, it's on you. I can't believe they bothered to tell that story in this documentary. Triple H, this is his origin story. This was greatly damaging to Triple H. So I'm pretty sure there's some alternate universe where Triple H got his beloved King of the Ring 1996 and none of this stuff actually happens. But when the boys started to leave and he talked about getting defensive, and I loved this part because it shows a shift in his mentality, but it says a lot too. Bret Hart, this is a really big part of the story, is Bret Hart. Because he talked about earlier when he switched the title to Bret. Bret's in there like he was safe. You know, he's not on steroids. He's not going to get caught in a hotel room with an underage girl. He was talking about Jerry Lawler, by the way. So he was a safe option. And Vince says, Bret doesn't have a lot of charisma. He's got some. But he was obviously looking for somebody else the entire time. But at the same time, as WCW was snatching up his stars, he tried to protect Bret. He tried to keep Bret. Signs Bret to this contract that he cannot possibly honor. And then has to go back on it. Hey, use this to go and get you a better deal. And then screw Bret over because Bret didn't want to do the job to Shawn. Yeah, Bret should have just done the job. And yes, I'm tired of the Montreal screw job too. I don't know why they had to tell this story, but it's important. It's important because it shows Vince's relationship with the boys. The business is more important than the boys. Bret Hart, when he said 14 years, I gave that guy Christmases that my kids missed. I didn't miss any shows. Very rarely got injured. Very rarely had any time off. 14 years. And this is how we part ways. Because Vince didn't trust me. He cared more about the business. Because he was paranoid. Medusa threw the belt in the trash. So he figured if she would do that. Now, he also brought a belt, the big gold belt on television in WWE. So he was familiar with the dirty tactics of WCW because he had done some of this stuff himself. And he thought Bret would do that. And I know he's historically said it's not that he didn't trust Bret, it's that he didn't trust Bischoff. Get out of here. Right? Just get out of here with that. They tell the story of Vince getting punched out and Bret was bitter. The story of Hulk Hogan, the building of Hulkamania. Stephanie says, she was always bothered by the fact that Vince didn't get enough credit for Hulk Hogan's success. I absolutely had to rewind that and listen to it again. And I was actually greatly surprised when they showed footage of Vince coaching Hulk Hogan through a promo. That was great footage, by the way. But Tony Atlas is like, every word that came out of Hulk Hogan's mouth, that was Vince McMahon. Only for Hogan to walk away during the steroid trial. And, Hogan was still loyal. But he had those dual loyalties. Despite the fact that him and Vince had a falling out, he didn't testify against Vince. He didn't send Vince to prison. He protected him. He looked after Vince. He still cared. And Vince was still kind of shitty about it. Of course, we find out later that the federal government essentially forced Hogan into testifying, that there was some kind of sword of Damocles they had over the head of Hulk Hogan, that they threatened to drop on him if he didn't testify. So Vince was found not guilty on the steroid trial. But the schism between Vince and Hogan maintained until Hogan came back and all that stuff, right? Undertaker, another interesting one because he had to take the streak from him. And he says he doesn't believe that Undertaker was really concussed at WrestleMania 30. Undertaker's talking about how he doesn't even remember the match. And Vince is like, there has to be some kind of psychological shock. And Undertaker is emotionally talking about how Vince left WrestleMania 30 to be at his side in the hospital, and he's choking up about this. And Vince is denying that there was a concussion even involved. Oh, wow. How detached from reality. He's detached from his own reality. He left the venue, so clearly he thought something was wrong. Why did you go to the hospital? I mean, maybe he's saying that in hindsight, he'd think that maybe the shock of losing took him out of the match or detached him from the match. But that still doesn't even make sense. And it seems it makes Vince look like he's out of touch. You know, this guy is choking up because Vince actually did something human. He left the most important event of the year because his top guy, a guy who had been with him for 30 years, is injured. And now he's sitting there saying, well, I don't think he was injured. It's like, what the hell is going on here? What's happening? This was your W. This was a dub. This was when everybody was going to be like, oh, at least Vince cares about somebody. And now you're denying that the guy was even hurt. He was forcefully taking that L, Vince. He was going to forcefully take that one. So as we peruse throughout the entire 6 episodes of Vince McMahon's relationship with talent, whether it be Undertaker, Hogan, Steve Austin, The Rock, Bret the Hitman Hart, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, he seems to be detached. Right? He wants there to be a fatherly relationship with the boys, but he also doesn't want to micromanage them, which is good because he's their boss. He's not literally their father. And he wants to have that healthy distance where these guys are free to do whatever they want. They're independent contractors, except if they don't want to do something and it's damaging to my company, we might need to nudge them in the appropriate direction. And of course, the single most detached moment of all time is continuing the show when Owen Hart passes away. He completely ignores how the talent might feel as they have, especially a guy like Jeff Jarrett. And Jeff Jarrett has been pretty open about this thing. You know, he had to continue working and his friend is dead or dying. Maybe I don't know whether he knew or not yet. But that is the kind of stuff that makes Vince sound like a ghoul. Average people are looking at this guy and saying, there's no loyalty there. You know, Bret Hart was there for 14 years. He stabbed him in the back. Hulk Hogan, you know, made fun of him for leaving the company. You know, made fun of his bald spot and all that kind of stuff in the Billionaire Ted skits. They didn't even get into him humiliating the Ultimate Warrior with the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior. They didn't get into that. They didn't get into The Rock doing the Get the F Out promo on Stone Cold Steve Austin. He denied that The Undertaker was hurt at WrestleMania 30. He showed zero humanity for Owen Hart, zero humanity for Chris Benoit. And both of these are extreme circumstances where to have brain damage to the level of Chris Benoit is almost unheard of. You know, Owen Hart falling from the ceiling is an absolute freak accident. And they make sure to show that the boys are human beings. When Brett says that he forgave Vince for Owen's death, when the police told him it was an accident and he forgave Vince, that made Brett seem like he was a great guy. All this stuff Vince did to me, I forgave him because the Owen Hart thing was a mistake. It was an accident. Yes, Brett's ego was completely out of control, thinking that, oh, they murdered my brother to get back at me. That's psychotic. But it wasn't as crazy as Vince doesn't care, right? Once he saw that Vince wasn't out to get him and that this was legitimately an accident, Bret Hart showed humanity, reached out and says, I forgave him. Undertaker is crying because Vince came to his side in the hospital. It's, you know, if you want to add Shane, he's emotional about the WrestleMania 32, the big hug that he got. But you don't see any of that stuff from Vince. And the detachment from the talent, it seems that that's on the surface. Because when you get to the lawsuit with Janelle Grant, you get that Vince is extremely close with Brock Lesnar, and he was using Janelle as a bargaining chip with Brock Lesnar. And Brock and Vince obviously have a very good relationship, much better than it used to be in the past. This is why when Vince was talking about Sable in the different part of the documentary, he kind of had a lapse in memory. Oh, I don't remember anything about Sable and her suing us. I just remember she came back to work. Oh, very suspicious that the one guy that you seem to be very close to in Brock Lesnar is married to a woman who sued the company for sexual harassment. And you don't remember that lawsuit. Okay. But Brock and Vince seem to be pretty close together. And if we assume that Janelle Grant's assertion is true and that Vince was sharing pictures with Brock and that Vince was, you know, using her as a bargaining chip with Brock, that Vince and Brock are pretty close. And that Brock's the kind of guy Vince wants in his inner circle. This, of course, makes him seem more human, but it's also kind of like the locker room gimmick where, you know, a guy has a girl and he shows pictures of this girl to all of his friends. So then, of course, if he was willing to show pictures to Brock, why not Undertaker? Why not John Cena? You know, what about throughout history? Did he do this kind of stuff? So it's pretty clear that Vince has a complex relationship with the boys, where he's obviously closer to some than he is to others. And of course, this also brings me to the Ultimate Warrior documentary that was aired on A&E. I believe it was in 2022 or 2023, where there is the subject of Warrior looking at Vince like a father figure. And Vince saying, I only have the one son. Kind of destroying this conception that the talent should look at him as a father figure. And you start getting all these mixed signals where Vince at sometimes is the boss, which he is all the time. And then sometimes he's your buddy, where he is willing to show you pictures of his girlfriends, which is to say that he has some talent, or at least that one talent, if we of course believe that that's true, that he let in on his personal life. That he let Brock Lesnar know, hey, I'm dealing with this girl. This is my girlfriend. This is who I'm seeing. And he's willing to leave the venue to be with Undertaker, and because he thinks the guy is injured. But then you have that weird detached Vince who doesn't see Jim Hellwig as a father, as a son kind of figure, even though he kind of had that relationship with all of the talent. That was oddly distant when Owen Hart fell from the ceiling. That kind of said, well, it was a terrible accident, but the show must go on. The guy who was super protective of the business when Bret Hart was going to leave. But he's also the guy who kept Shawn Michaels on payroll, even when Shawn couldn't wrestle. He was also the guy who helped put together the drug rehab program, where former talent like a Scott Hall or a Jake the Snake Roberts and all those guys could go in and get treatment if they needed it. But he's also the guy where if you died, he didn't want anything to do with it. If you were Mr. Perfect or the Big Boss Man or Test and you died of an overdose or, drug-related suicide, Vince accepted no responsibility. It was almost as if you were on an island on your own. So there's an incredible amount of complexity and flexibility and leeway with Vince's relationship with the boys. Some of which was discussed in the documentary. Some of it was left out. They obviously mentioned his relationship with Brock Lesnar. And they mentioned his relationship with Undertaker and his relationship with Bret Hart and his relationship with Hulk Hogan, who Hulk Hogan wouldn't even testify against him in the steroid trial, even though that's what the government wanted. Hogan took the chance of going to prison to keep Vince out of prison. And you see that Hogan was rewarded later on with, he was allowed back into the fold. But what they didn't mention? They didn't mention how Vince felt about Hulk Hogan's racist thing, right? They didn't ask Vince what he thought about that. As I thought that would have been something interesting to ask him a question about. This is the biggest star and one of the biggest stars in the history of the business. Certainly top 5 biggest stars in your company's history. And you didn't ask him at all about his feelings about Hulk Hogan and the racist tapes? I would think that would have been important to ask him about. And you see that Vince sometimes is even inspired by the boys, as he's inspired by Dr. Jerry Graham. And that sometimes he uses the boys as surrogates, like he did with Ted DiBiase. And he, kind of imposed all the things that he would like to have been, or ideas about himself, onto Ted DiBiase to create the $1 Million Man. But of course, that wasn't discussed in the documentary either. But you see from looking at the documentary that Vince's relationship with the boys is very complex. On the one hand, you've got that father figure situation that he has with all of them. He's a buddy to some of them. He bails a lot of the boys out quite often. When Dr. D. David Schultz smacked John Stossel, he got suspended by the New York State Athletic Commission, and he was, I believe, banned from the state for a while, and he had to pay a fine. Vince took care of all of that for him. That was not mentioned in the documentary. The drug program, the rehab program, was not mentioned in the documentary. Now, the wellness policy was mentioned, but that's different. The rehab program, which exists even for former talent, is a different program. Then the wellness policy applies to people who are currently on the roster. The rehab program applies to guys who used to work there. So that wasn't mentioned. So you see that his relationship to the boys can be warm and interesting. It can also be dirty and gross. It can also be very cold and distant. And it all depends mostly on who you're talking about and what era you're talking about. Because Vince himself was basically one of the boys during the Attitude Era, where he was wrestling and he was in the ring and his son was in the ring, taking chairs to the head, taking shovels to the face. So instead of living vicariously through Ted DiBiase or Dr. Jerry Graham, he got to do it himself. So his appreciation for the boys should have been stronger, and it should have been expressed in the documentary. And it wasn't. He came across like a typical, distant, cold boss who does not care about you. Or if he does care about you, it's minimal. Only so much as you're not really affecting business. You're not really affecting the company at all. Or any benefit to you has to come with a benefit to the company. And that's off-putting, if we're being honest. And so you have to take that into account when Vince is talking about Shane, and Shane doesn't want his sister dating a wrestler, and Vince is like, well, I'm a wrestler. It's like, are you really? Because when we see your interactions and your thoughts about the wrestlers, they're not negative. It's not like, screw them, they're just cattle. It's not cruel, but it's not human either. It's not warm. It's not inviting. It doesn't have that family, extended family feel that he is talking about. And this leads to what he said in episode 3 when he was confronted with being a hypocrite about, WCW stealing his stars and him complaining about it. He says, sometimes what I say is different from what I think. And then he starts talking about how it's about controlling his thought process. He's a businessman. He doesn't always say what he feels. And sometimes people want to hear how you feel. That's what people want. They want to hear how you feel. But it seems like Vince is being forced to deal with these dragons. Like he's Link from Zelda. And here comes this monster. And it's not even really a monster. It's just another person's emotions. And he has to fight it with a sword and shield. Instead of just accepting. And then giving something back. A little. And this is what people are asking for. This is what people expect. You work in a niche industry where not a lot of people understand what's going on in that locker room. Not a lot of people understand what's going on in that ring. And you're talking to people who are complete aliens to what you do. And you're the best at it. And you're the biggest goddamn alien in the room. That makes people start to believe that you are every single thing that they've heard. Because they don't see anything different. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.